Welcome to Building Back Better, International Financial Institutions and COVID-19. I'm Lawrence MacDonald. I'm the Vice President of Communications at the World Resources Institute. I want to welcome our attendees. We had about 600 people sign up last night from all around the world, and it's really our privilege. We know that you're all very busy, so we're looking forward to making a good use of your time. This is the third in a series that we are doing in response to the global pandemic and the economic and development impacts of that. The first was a set of global perspectives. The second was a deep dive on the opportunities within the US stimulus package to advance climate action and sustainable action. And this one is focused on the international financial institutions. As many of you who are listening know, the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank begin tomorrow. In this unprecedented situation, the meetings are being held entirely virtually. Many of you will know that typically finance ministers and other people concerned with international development and finance come to Washington and spend the better part of a week together, exchanging views. Several of the people on our panel today have been frequent participants in exactly that kind of a meeting. And normally we wouldn't get to hear from them. They would be busy hobnobbing in the hallways. Instead, they're here with us. And so this, I think, will be a great opportunity for all of us to hear from these experts on the nature of the international financial institutions' response to the crisis, especially the development and economic implications of that. And of particular interest to this audience and to our panelists and people at the World Resources Institute is the impact on climate action and the related question of climate finance. I'll say just one more thing before I introduce Leo Martinez-Diaz, my colleague at WRI, and that is yesterday we had our global board meeting at the World Resources Institute, also, of course, done virtually. And one of the board members said that this is not just a once-in-a-generation realignment, it's once-in-a-century realignment. It's the kind of change we last saw with the Great Depression and World War II and the creation of the international financial institutions. And another one said, WRI has an opportunity, WRI, and I would say the broader community that's on this call, has an opportunity to influence what goes into a $10 trillion check, which is the likely size of the global stimulus package that is being mobilized in response to the epidemic. So on the one hand, it's a frightening time, a time of anxiety, a time when many of us worry that the climate crisis, which is also imminent, may be pushed into a back seat. On the other hand, it's an incredible opportunity, if you will, to ensure that the massive resources being devoted to respond to the economic crisis caused by the epidemic are put to good use. And that's what we're going to be hearing about from our panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Leo Martinez-Diaz. He's the Global Director of Sustainable Finance at WRI. Before he joined us, Leo was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment, where he oversaw relationships with multilateral institutions. He was also responsible for international work on climate finance involving organizations like the G7, G20, UNFCCC, and also for US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. He's previously worked in Indonesia and in Mexico. It's my privilege and pleasure to yield the floor to you, Leo.
Thanks so much, Lawrence, and good morning and good evening to all of you. My job is to set the table here for the conversation we're going to have with the panel. Let me start with the obvious. We are dealing with the most severe global economic crisis since the Great Depression. The pandemic, as you know, started in China and has moved to Europe and to the United States, affecting all the major economies. But now it is beginning to work its way into low-income countries and to many other middle-income countries as well. We have not yet begun to see the full manifestation of the economic impacts, not to mention the social implications of the crisis. And therefore, a response now is essential. And the earlier and more effective we can be, in that response, the lower the long-term suffering and long-term economic damage will have. That's why what we're going to discuss today is so important and so urgent. Developing countries are going to get hit in two different ways. One, of course, is from the virus itself and the measures to contain the virus, which will mean social distancing, and it will mean shutting down businesses and job losses and so on. At the same time, recall that developing countries are often very connected to the engines of the world economy, and they will also see cross-border contagion effects. They already are seeing commodities prices drop. Those that export commodities are going to suffer losses of income because of that. Tourism, which is very important for many developing countries, is drying up, and that will have an impact. And of course, we have seen over $100 billion of capital leave emerging markets and other developing countries as investors look for safety. All of this is making the fiscal conditions and the ability of developing countries to respond to the crisis even more serious, and it is putting a lot of fiscal pressure and financial pressure on banks, on companies, and on governments. Therefore, it is crucial then that the international community respond to this crisis, and it do so with overwhelming force. At the front lines, of course, are the multilateral development banks, the national development banks, and the International Monetary Fund. These are usually the, in peacetime situations, if you will, these are the institutions that are in charge of helping finance development, helping surveil macroeconomic situations, and to provide financing in cases of emergency. Now that we are in, if you will, a full-time a war footing, it is crucial that these institutions deliver quick financing to help deal with the crisis. The multilateral development banks already are doing that. They have started with phase one, which is the moment where you have to inject quick financing to countries. Altogether, the multilateral banks have announced about $100 billion worth of immediate assistance. That includes about $14 billion from the World Bank. And of course, IDA, the World Bank's branch that focuses on the poorest countries, has already announced about $1.3 billion of new funding for those countries. I would say very broadly, this phase one is about four things. The first is about ensuring that countries have money for healthcare, for testing, for reporting on the COVID spread, and for helping ensure that the hospitals and the emergency services have the resources they need. The second thing we're seeing from the development banks is money for social safety nets. All of those systems that help protect the poorest and most vulnerable, to get money to workers who are unemployed, to get food assistance to those who need it. The third is trade finance. This might be a bit obscure, but it is absolutely crucial. It is essentially the system of credits that allow trade to happen. And this is very important because, of course, we need to keep the engine of trade moving as best we can. And finally, the MDVs are providing money directly to banks in countries who can then on-lend that money to companies. And some banks that have the ability to do so are providing credit directly to small and medium-sized enterprises across developing countries. All of this is part of phase one. It is about keeping the money flowing. It's about trying to preserve jobs. It's about responding to the virus. Very soon we'll be moving into phase two. Phase two will be even larger in terms of financial capital that will be deployed, and it will use a lot of so-called policy-based loans. That is to say, loans that can be deployed very quickly, very flexibly, that governments can use directly into their budgets, and they can use them to cover a number of public investments and public spending. The World Bank has already announced about $160 billion over the next 15 months that will go into this next phase. I don't want to leave out the national development banks. These are banks that are mostly state-owned in developing countries. They can be very large institutions, but they also can be small and medium-sized. These banks tend to have strong relationships with their local communities, local companies, and they will also be part of the front lines of responding to the crisis. Many of them are part of this thing called the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, and together they are already mounting a defense and a response to the crisis. For example, AFD, the French Development Bank, has announced 1.2 billion euro for COVID response in Africa. And BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank, about which Joaquim will talk about a bit further, has announced an $11 billion package for assistance in Brazil. I think it's worth mentioning very briefly the International Monetary Fund. It's not, I think, a main focus of the discussion today, but it is also very much on the front lines. Their job, as you may know, is to provide immediate finance for governments for what's known as balance of payments relief. Basically, their ability to continue to get the access to dollar funding that allows them to service debt, to trade, and to keep the economy running. Over 100 countries have now applied to the IMF for emergency assistance, and the fund has $1 trillion firefighting capacity right now, which is going to deploy to help many of those countries. The question is whether it will require additional financing to keep doing what it needs to do. Finally, we are in the middle of a twin crisis. One is about the pandemic, but the second, as Lawrence mentioned, is about climate change. Climate change has not stopped. Indeed, the impacts continue. Just 2 weeks ago, a major typhoon hit Pacific islands, including Fiji, which are trying to recover from the virus as well. Folks are projecting a more than active Atlantic hurricane season this year. So it is possible that climate impacts could exacerbate the pandemic. And therefore we have to continue the fight to arrest climate change, which means what will happen to climate finance? The entities, the institutions that I talked about earlier, all of them have been on the front line of the battle against climate change. They have been very important providers of money to fight climate. And as a result of this current emergency, the question will be how to try to address both to the extent possible and appropriate at the same time. We just put out a blog yesterday trying to say, look, we need to look at ways in which there may be ways, for example, to enhance resilience to the pandemic that will also have co-benefits in terms of climate change. The more we can try to create complementary investments and try to address both emergencies, the better we're going to be. Let me stop with that. I think we have some very important issues on the table, and I very much look forward to the conversation. Back to you, Lawrence.
Leo, thank you very much. One of my colleagues is posting the slide that some of you saw at the beginning, which gives an overview of our speaker lineup. I won't name all the speakers now. I'll introduce them as we go through. Suffice to say that we have a great deal of knowledge here. One of the unpleasant tasks of my role is to ask them to each confine their opening remarks to 3 minutes. I'll give a gentle warning at 3, and then if it goes to 4, I'll give another a gentle warning. I'm going to do that because I know that one of the most interesting pieces of this is the question and answer. You can see at the bottom of that slide that to submit a question, you can use the Q&A button on the Zoom. We will be selecting among those questions, and I'll be reading some of them out and directing them to the panelists at the end. So we do want to leave time for the Q&A. I think by now everybody's very comfortable with Zoom. If you're new to this, if you mouse to the top of your screen, you can select between speaker view and grid view. When somebody is speaking, you may find that speaker view is the better view in which you can focus just on the person who's speaking. It's now my privilege to introduce Amal-Lee Amin. Amal-Lee Amin is the climate director at the CDC Group, which is the UK's publicly owned impact investor. Before going to the CDC Group, she was the chief of climate change at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she led a successful effort to double the level of climate finance. She's spent more than 10 years working on sustainable energy and climate change policy within the UK government before that. Amal-Lee, I think the question people would like to hear from you about is what should the multilateral development banks and the larger family of development finance institutions do to assist the recovery? And I think for this audience, it's appropriate also to say to assist the recovery and at the same time advance action on what Leo referred to as the other urgent global crisis, climate action. Amal-Lee, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak on such an important and urgent topic. I think, as Leo set out very clearly, there are a number of measures that are needed and already being undertaken in this phase 1 of the process. So I will focus more on the phase 2, the recovery and the build back better. I think, as you said, Lawrence, at the beginning, this really is a once in a century opportunity to actually build back better. Of course, none of us would have wanted it this way, but as we do look to shore up all economies across the world, there are real opportunities to ensure that those measures are consistent with much more inclusive, resilient, and low carbon measures that will also enable the climate crisis to be addressed alongside, very importantly, delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've been thinking about this in the context of, and CDC, we work as an impact investor mainly with the private sector, but we know a lot of what needs to happen in the coming year or so will really require the leadership of governments, and I think in particular the multilateral development banks that have very strong trusted relationships with governments. And we'll hear from Anthony from the African Development Bank. Certainly I know colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank having very close relationships that can help to really regenerate the economies in a way that can be consistent with other objectives. And so these are sort of 3 main areas that I've been thinking about that I think will be really valuable for the multilateral financial system to help bring forward in this phase 2 recovery process. First, I think the role of nature-based solutions, that's been a topic of much discussion the last couple of years. And when we look at previous crises, even in the US, when Roosevelt brought people back to work with civil conservation programs, getting people, particularly low-skilled, the informal sector, all those migrant workers back into paid work with literally shovel-ready projects, whether it's planting trees, whether it's doing watershed management, whether it's restoring land in both rural but also an urban context, actually. A lot of this, I think, will be very consistent with getting those lower skilled workers back into work really quickly, as long as, and ensuring payment goes into those types of activities. Potentially the existing cash transfer programs that I know the IDB has a very well developed cash transfer program could be utilized for that, other possible channels. I would say, secondly, it very much relates to the point Leo made around these policy-based loans. We saw back in 2009, actually, the IDB, the World Bank, AFD, provided a number of governments in Latin America with these policy-based loans around climate change to create the climate-related institutional context that were needed. Well, now there's opportunity to go further, I would say, particularly around sustainable infrastructure, because we know that in looking at the recovery, sustainable infrastructure has to be part of the growth agenda. So the IDB, with the World Bank, with EBRD and others,
One more minute, Amal.
On a framework that I believe can be integrated upstream into the institutional context through these policy-based loans, these fast dispersing loans. And finally, my third point is how to really reignite the private sector. And I think for the MDBs, that will likely be through financial institutions, whether public or commercial banks, to help bring forward SMEs in particular. For organizations such as CDC, we can work more directly through direct equity, through funds, and directly with SMEs. And really, I see the opportunities there to create much more modular, distributed technologies for the energy sector, relating to storage, smart grids, looking at diagnostics that will be important for healthcare, but also around climate resiliency, as well as other types of investments around a circular economy, and really reigniting these strong markets in the developing and emerging countries to really help build back better, as we've talked about.
Thank you so much, Amal-Lee. There's so much that is very rich there. I'm going to turn now to Anthony Nyong. He's the Director for Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. He was recently named as one of the 100 most influential people in climate policy. Anthony is also a co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions as a coordinating author for the IPCC report. Anthony, what should the MDBs do to assist the recovery in the Africa region? And can you provide examples from the African Development Bank? Very eager to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a privilege to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Lawrence and WRI and the team for inviting us. Let me also point out that seated right there, Amal-Lee is one of the other 100 most influential people. So you have quite a big, good team here. Yeah, thanks so much.
Amal-Lee needs a better PR team. It showed up in your bio and it didn't show up in hers. So I apologize, okay. Amal-Lee. I should have known that. Congratulations for being named in that capacity.
Yeah, thanks. I think for us, before we really start going into recovery starts from better managing where we are. That's what places us in a good footing to deal with issues of recovery. For us as a continent, I think there is a challenge in the sense that COVID-19 just exacerbates an existing inequality, existing high vulnerability. We have 5 beds in intensive care units per million people in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to what you have in other regions, other claims that have up to 4,000 beds per million people. We have 5. And so these are the issues we deal with, that this virus might stay with us much longer than it ought to. While others have gone into recovery stage, we are still there trying to deal with this. So permit me, still trying to stress the fact that we need to deal with this. We are not facing coronavirus. We're facing 5 different shocks at the same time. And this will allow us to navigate how we get through that. We're experiencing a social shock. That first social shock could come from the health issue we are seeing. It could come from the fact that we have not been able to tell the story of coronavirus well, or COVID-19. The stigma around it is huge. It's making people run away. They don't want to receive treatment because people think once you have COVID-19, you're doomed to hell. And so this makes people to basically stay away from what should not have been a major issue. We talk about cleaning hands. We had the same issues with Ebola. We're coming back again. How wash your hands well. Check the statistics of Africans that have access to water. I'm not even talking about clean water. Then we're talking about washing hands and all that. These are things that still need to be done, and done very urgently. What we are seeing is, I can tell you that I'm not sure we are managing this crisis properly. We have lessons from climate change that we can look at. Ebola came, and we saw that the best way we could manage Ebola was through disease surveillance, was through strengthening those infrastructure, those institutions. For us in Africa, it is those institutions we established or strengthened that are helping in addressing the issues today. But what do we have? We're setting up recovery rooms, treatment centers in national stadium and other public places. And we're going to pack our tents and leave once we think we've accomplished it, only to reappear again another decade or less, still with the same emergency measures. In climate change, we've been able to establish that of the resources that go to disaster risk management, 88% goes to post-disaster management, just palliatives. Only 12% goes to building resilience. And we're seeing that.
Anthony, one more minute. Just you're doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And we're seeing that happening here. So for us, we would want to see as much as we can areas where we can deal with the resilience. We are going into a hurricane season, and I am not sure how we're going to tell those people that will be flooded how they need to self-quarantine or do things. We should not take our minds off the climate change. If you look at what is happening in East Africa, you see desert locusts eating up almost everything in its sight. We're not talking about it because everyone is concentrating on this. When we are done and we want to go into the recovery, the women who've lost livelihoods, the children, everything, those are the ones that will now be exposed, that we could have done something to build resilience. So I think the MDBs, we need to look at what really works in each of our regions so that we can provide tailored solutions driven by those countries on what is important to them, but climate change should not be put at the back burner, nor even take off the burner completely.
Anthony, thank you very much. I want to turn now to Joaquim Levy. I'm pleased to say that in addition to his many other accomplishments, Joaquim is a member of the WI Global Board. He's also the former president of the Brazilian Development Bank, one of the largest national development banks in the world, and a former managing director and chief financial officer at the World Bank, a former minister of finance for Brazil, and he's currently at the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance at Stanford University. Joaquim, when we invited you to be part of this, you said, I would like to talk about the role of the national development banks. And as Leo mentioned, that's clearly an important piece of this, and a piece that I think is sometimes overlooked in Washington, where we tend to focus more on the multilateral banks. Can you tell us about the role of the national banks and maybe give us some examples from the bank that you previously led in Brazil? You might be muted.
Hello. So good morning. I think that you're right. The national development banks are in the front line of most of these economies. And actually, if you look at the balance sheet of the whole group, it dwarfs that of multilateral banks. Now it varies a lot because you have from say Germany or France with large development banks, and then you have China, of course, where you have the Chinese Development Bank, and a number of say G20 countries, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, where their development banks have a very important role, as well as in South Africa. Actually, as you mentioned, Leo mentioned, we have this club of these development institutions, and they involve about 23 of these institutions, including also JICA from Japan, etc. And you have another group just for OECD group countries. And what I have seen is that they have taken measures very quickly, because often they are the way to implement some of the decisions of their own treasuries. So we can count literally hundreds of these measures, usually like a standstill, waiving, say, interest payments, but also more and more giving real cash to companies. I think about the repercussions of these crises, of course, is the fact that as you stop, you have not only the problem of the direct payment of employees and so on, but then the waves that go through all the supplier lines. And this is really the fabric of an economy. So finding ways that you don't have, say, the shock being through all the system and disorganizing everything is essential. In the case of Brazil, BNDES has been doing also, for instance, the helping companies to pay their employees, so they lend for specific programs. In the case of BNDES, more than 1.5 million, about 1.5 million companies that complement the direct cash payments that the government is doing to so the people in the informal market. So you cover both formal and informal market. Now looking ahead, what these banks you have to do? I think they have to accelerate a movement they already had, which was of including more and more climate as an integral part of their activities, as well as supporting health. BNDES, I have a lot of pride that you always supported hospitals in renovating their installations, etc. And actually, at this moment, BNDES has been absolutely fundamental in mobilizing the domestic industry in Brazil to produce ventilators, to ensure masks, to ensure everything that is needed, including to start the normalization of life. If you want to go from isolation to a more normal life, you have to have all these systems working, including, say, testing, etc. In a country like Brazil that has a good industrial basis, the thing is how to coordinate it and how to ensure they have the resources of doing that. And this is exactly what BNDES is doing. So when you look across all the development banks, some of them work very closely with the international development banks because they own land, money that is given by multilaterals. And I think this will be very important because for some countries, we're going to have problems of balance of payments pretty soon. Yesterday, we saw some institutions saying that probably, especially with the disorganization of international trade, you're pretty soon you're going to have $1 trillion problem in all the emerging market economies. So working together, the international institutions with domestic institutions is fundamental. Financing health is the first step to ensure the normalization of the economy. And as we look forward, we have to make an integral part of every action of development banks, international or national, to look at climate, which is the second crisis that we've been talking a lot for the last few years. But when life is normal, often we don't take the actions that are necessary. Now I think the degree of awareness has increased sufficiently that this has to be put in the forefront of the strategies of government and of development institutions.
Thank you, Joaquim. I'm monitoring the questions that are coming in, and it's interesting that a couple of them have anticipated our next two speakers. There's a question about the connection between human rights, COVID, and climate action. So I'm pleased to say that our next speaker is going to address that. And there's also a question about debt sustainability, and our final speaker is going to be speaking about debt. I also saw a question directed specifically at Tony and Amal-Lee. It's helpful to me as moderator if you do have a question for a particular person, if you flag that, it'll help me in directing that question to that speaker. Again, the question button is at the bottom of your screen. It's now my privilege to introduce our next speaker. Jolie Schwarz is Policy Director at the Bank Information Center. Some of you know that the Bank Information Center, known to its friends, I think, as BIC, advocates for transparency, accountability, sustainability, and inclusion in development finance. And Jolie is a human rights lawyer who was previously with the Human Rights Foundation. Jolie, my question for you is, your organization's been monitoring the MDBs for many years. What lessons from previous crises should the MDBs take to heart as they respond to COVID?
Thanks, Lauren, so much for having me and the opportunity to participate in this discussion. There are a few really key lessons that I think can be learned from past crises, as well as from project level failures that the MDBs should take to heart as they structure their response to COVID-19 in order to make sure that they're living out their mandates even in these challenging times. And I'll just mention a few and try to stick to my time. So first, the MDBs should keep in mind that even as they respond to this crisis with much needed urgency, it's still very important to adhere to high standards for managing social and environmental risks associated with their projects and to know where every dollar is going. MDB projects, as many people know, are not created overnight. There's a lot of planning and design that goes into them, including anticipating and managing any risks that they may pose to people and the environment. Unfortunately, we've learned in past crises that social and environmental risk management, as well as measures to ensure transparency and accountability of investments, can be a lower priority when there are very real pressures to get money out the door. As Leo mentioned, the MDBs will very likely turn to lending instruments like policy-based lending instruments that are subject sometimes to weaker environmental and social standards. We saw this in the response of the World Bank to the 2008 financial crisis when it relied heavily on the use of these types of instruments. And relatedly, we know that the bulk of IFC financing will be channeled through financial intermediary clients, which, despite some recent improvements made by the IFC that make it easier to monitor and address ENS risks, a large part of this lending is still very difficult to track or to measure in terms of its development impact. So to be clear, these instruments can be used in really positive ways. As Amal-Lee mentioned, policy-based loans have a lot of potential to enhance national policy and institutional frameworks that can advance an ambitious climate agenda. However, robust environmental and social standards should also be applied to the loans themselves. And without proper risk management, these investments can have really negative consequences and even undermine their response in many ways. The other lesson I just want to mention is that the MDB's response should not ignore those most at risk from the impacts of the pandemic as well as the economic downturn. As Anthony mentioned, the crisis will exacerbate existing inequalities. People that are already vulnerable because of poverty, environmental degradation, or limited access to healthcare education are likely going to experience the most lasting impacts of the crisis and could be left behind in the recovery. So while there's been some really positive rhetoric from the World Bank so far on the need to reach the most vulnerable in the response, another lesson learned from the 2008 financial crisis that the World Bank's own independent evaluation group has pointed out is that the institution could have more clearly articulated its objectives for addressing the social impacts of the crisis. And so I think all the MDBs should really heed this advice and also make sure that staff have really clear guidance on how to achieve those objectives. And finally, just one other thing to mention here, there should be a much stronger effort to integrate climate change in the MDB's response strategy, as others have mentioned. Much more, I think, could have been done in the response to the 2008 financial crisis to lay the groundwork for a strong global recovery that advanced a resilient low-carbon future. However, as we know, many MDBs still support fossil fuel projects, both directly and indirectly. And we do know, though, that investing in programs that aim to reduce inequality and address existing vulnerabilities will increase resilience to future crises. There are also many parallels between the pandemic crisis and the climate crisis that we face, and some of the efforts to address them as well as their drivers are really intertwined. And the MDB should keep this in mind when designing programs that could respond to both of these crises with the urgency that is required. And they must also be vigilant that their response to one crisis does not inadvertently exacerbate the other. So I'll stop there and look forward to robust discussion.
Thank you, Jolie. What wise words. Make sure that our response to one crisis doesn't make another one worse, but in fact helps to address the other crisis. We turn now to our last panel member, and I want to thank all my panelists for sticking closely to your time. It does mean that we'll have time for discussion. Scott Morris is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Scott, you have several other titles there at CGD that I'm not effectively capturing. Self-disclosure, Scott and I were colleagues when I worked at the Center for Global Development, and I've long admired your intellect and your clarity of thinking, Scott. Scott was a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Treasury for Development Finance and Debt. In that role, he led 4 replenishments of the international financial institutions. Scott, there were really sort of 2 questions. One has already been posed by a member of our audience, is what are the likely impacts on this, on developing country debt, and will there be need for yet another debt bailout? And then a question that I think goes to your experience in mobilizing capital. Sometimes I think people think the international financial institutions just keep writing checks, but obviously they have to mobilize capital as well. And are they going, how do you see them responding to that need to mobilize capital, and will the international community be forthcoming in response? Scott, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Lawrence, and thanks. It's good to be here, and we do miss you at CGD. So let me talk about the role of debt relief, and then, as you said, a little bit that, even on the question of debt, there are trade-offs, and it's important to recognize that. So let me just try to quickly answer the question of why debt relief, and then the how. And the why, frankly, is much easier to answer than the how. But basically, when it comes to even the poorest countries, so the low income, low middle income countries that are eligible for MDB concessional financing, they have significant debt burdens in terms of debt owed to external creditors. And there's sort of been growing debt risk even before this pandemic hit. So in fact, a majority of these low-income countries were already at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress before the shock. The pandemic itself, as Leo in particular laid out, represents a massive economic shock beyond the direct health effects. All of which strongly suggests that a very large group of these countries are not going to be able to service their external debt in the months ahead and certainly in the years ahead. But more importantly than that, so recognizing the inevitability of that, even more importantly is to recognize what is the crisis response imperative right now, which is that these countries need the maximum amount of fiscal space to directly confront the crisis. So this represents one of the trade-offs. Payments they're having to make to external creditors is money that's not available to do direct support within their own economies in the short term. And I think that's, there's an overriding sort of compelling need there that drives a lot of the rationale for addressing the debt issue. Just in terms of numbers, if we look at this group of countries as a whole, their debt service this year to external creditors is about $40 billion, 40 I should say. And that's divided among groups of creditors, and I'll come back to that briefly to recognize the challenges of each of these creditor groups. The MDBs are about $12 billion of that this year. Other government creditors, the so-called bilateral creditors, are about $18 billion. And then commercial creditors, bond markets, banks, are about $10 billion. The how of debt relief, this is where it gets very difficult. So this week we have what I viewed as a very constructive, positive step announced by the G20 finance ministers, which was an agreement among those countries, the G20 countries, to implement a standstill on payments owed to them as creditors. So these are the bilateral creditors, and certainly the G20 represents the vast majority of these lending activities among governments. So they've agreed to a standstill for approximately an 8-month period in which countries will not have to make payments on interest or principal during that period. Again, I think this is a very good first step for a number of reasons. A leading one is that we have China on board. China committed to a coordinated action here with a lot of detail to it in terms of exactly how the standstill will go, sort of precise terms for it. So a common term sheet. And that speaks sort of as a step, a first step, it speaks to sort of a way of proceeding that's going to be important as we confront what are going to be a tougher set of negotiations. Namely, we do have to get beyond the debt standstill to actual debt relief, meaning there is an inevitability that a large group of these countries are going to need a reduction in debt. This standstill does not reduce payments. These payments will still be due in the future if nothing further is done. So we're now confronting a period ahead.
Perhaps one more minute, Scott.
So where these countries will have to come together and hopefully coordinate on what relief might look like. It looks very different for these different groups of creditors. There is no standing coordinated mechanism for private creditors at a time when even low-income countries have a lot of credits with private creditors, and that's going to be a challenge. The MDBs themselves, and I'll close with this because it speaks to the trade-offs. The MDBs themselves are a major group of creditors to these countries, and there's sort of important questions about should they be offering debt relief, and what are the trade-offs that entails for them as crisis lenders. And I think here it's important, whatever that decision ultimately is, what is most important, particularly as crisis response, is to keep track of what we would call the net flows from MDBs? Are they scaling up their financing support to a degree that ensures that whatever the ongoing payments back to them are, they are much smaller than the new lending and new support they are providing during the crisis? And I think that's the critical measure to keep track of going forward, that these are crisis lenders, among other things, and we need to be sure that they're doing the maximum that they can, even as we contemplate debt relief in some form going forward. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Scott. Anthony, you told me you were going to have to leave early. I'll make the apologies on your behalf, but we do have a question directed specifically at you, if you can give us a couple minutes for your response. Also directed to Amal-Lee. I'll come with the same question to you second, but I'm going to invite Anthony first because I know he has to leave. The question is, what role do you see for the international financial institutions in supporting smallholder farmers, particularly partnerships with the private sector actors like input suppliers? That comes from Colby Wilkins. And I think many people think of the crisis as being mostly an urban phenomena, but it's clearly going to hit in the countryside and in regions like Africa and much of the developing world where so many people make their living in agriculture. Support to smallholders is clearly going to be very important. Eager for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for the understanding. For us, we've already gone into what we may consider a recovery mode, because like I mentioned earlier, when this sickness or disease is done, people have to go back to their livelihoods. And for us, smallholder agriculture is a mainstay of most of our economies. And we realize how they might be impacted. The African Development Bank has set up two initiatives. The first is the Fight COVID-19 Social Bond that we launched for 3 billion oversubscribed. Part of that money is going into such processes to build resilience and build livelihoods. We've also set up a COVID-19 rapid response facility that makes money available within 5 days to states. But a lot of that is not just budget support, like we've talked about. There's going to be a lot for budget support to those policy-based lending, but much of it also will go to specific activities. At this point, we are battling desert locusts. Like I've mentioned, you need to take a look and see what's going on there. These are small farmers that are losing their complete farms and livelihoods. So we're still investing in that and ensuring that when they come out of this quarantine or whatever happens, that they still have a livelihood. So the international finance institutions have a role to play. We are a development bank. These are the key partners we have for our development, whether in terms of climate change, in terms of smart agriculture, in terms of name it, it's very important to us. So we have a role to play to sustain our economic modes, and the smallholder farmers have a great role to play there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthony. You may drop off when you wish. I know you had a prior commitment, and appreciate you carving out time to join us. It's been very helpful.
Thank you so very much, everyone. Thanks, and wish a lovely discussion here.
Thank you. Amal-Lee, the question about support for smallholder farmers, I think, was also directed at you, given your experience, maybe particularly in Latin America, but it's clearly a problem that extends around the world, in the developing world. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important area that many of the MDBs are working on. I mean, we at CDC are also looking at how to promote more sustainable agro practices. I think, you know, for the smallholder farmers, it's going to be really important that they do have access to the right kind of credit, maybe, you know, affordable credit that's maybe sort of concessional lines of credit that may be provided through local banks, alongside probably technical assistance to help ensure that the products and the farming practices that farmers are going to move into or really can be more climate smart, more resilient. And that may also include looking at the role of nature-based solutions within a resiliency context, for example, in watershed management, to make farming areas more resilient to droughts in the future. And And I think, you know, being able to ensure that resources get down to those farmers, but also that the banking community is also being incentivized to really provide the right types of investments that can help build in resiliency. I just wanted to respond to another question I saw about resiliency in nature. And I think when we think about resiliency moving forward, we talk a lot about resiliency to climate impacts, but I think we probably need to recognize that resiliency needs to be across societies, and you know, the interaction between nature and societies and communities is part of the resiliency that we need to see, whether it's health, cleaner air, cleaner water, as well as also resiliency to droughts, to hurricanes even. And so I think we probably do need to sort of recognize that that resiliency is something that is going to be very consistent with the climate agenda. I think also I mentioned the sort of focus more on modular, distributed networks, whether those are in the energy sector, whether it's in even in the farming community, that those also can be more resilient if developed well moving forward.
Thanks very much, Amal-Lee. I'm seeing an interesting trend in the questions, and maybe some of the other panels have noticed it. Anthony Hobley and a couple of others have expressed concern that the climate community and raising climate, maybe raising it at all, will upset people, because after all, this is a global health crisis. People are dying. And they urge caution and question how that can be done. I think that that's something we're trying very hard to do here at WRI and in this discussion, but it sort of goes to narrative. I see Joaquim's got his finger up in response to that. Another question that's coming through is concern, maybe at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, that some countries, different questioners mentioned China or the United States, may use the crisis as an opportunity to dial back on their climate ambition. Somebody mentioned China reopening coal plants. Certainly in the United States, the administration has been busily dismantling climate action and climate protection, and that has now accelerated with the crisis. So concern that some of the big emitters may be seizing the opportunity to go in the opposite direction, and a question about what can be done about that. That kind of goes in the opposite direction of saying, please don't talk about climate because you might upset people. So I think there's a tension there between those two things. Joaquim, one of those questions was directed at you in particular, saying maybe developing countries have never particularly prioritized climate. I think that's an unfair generalization. Some certainly have. But what do you see in terms of maybe some of the big emitters going backwards in your country in particular? You pay, like here in the United States, you have a challenge with the leadership. Any reflections on that?
Yes, I think that it's a very good question, and also the concern expressed is also very important. What you have to keep in mind is that climate can help directly in two ways in this recovery phase. Okay, in addition to the links to health that, for instance, Leo mentioned at the beginning, which are very strong. First, there are many opportunities for low-skill, immediate, local activities, like was mentioned before, but also our experience is that some of the key things in climate is starting with energy, are things that have higher productivity than existing say technologies and existing say business, say fossil to solar, fossil to other sources of sustainable energy. If you do it right, you gain productivity. And this will be extremely important at this phase to recover the global economy. We're only going to get back after this shock to get employment and so on, even in a very different way, if you move to things that are more productive. So you have to take the moment to facilitate the transition rather than to go back, because usually you know that point B is better than point A, but there are hurdles. At this moment in time, when you're moving all the things, you have more degrees of freedom to actually is a time that you should use some of your resources to help this transition. Just one thing, for instance, about Brazil, BNDES actually has had a fundamental role in financing wind and the solar energy. And what is the good news is that actually today at the margin it's cheaper, it's more affordable without any subsidy to have a solar and wind than gas and even than hydro, and with much lower environmental impact. So this is the way to go, and I think other countries are doing this. South Africa is really addressing all the challenges of coal, and we really hope that, for instance, China take advantage of this moment to do the huge social engineering that is necessary. We recognize that to move away from coal. It's hard, but it's the moment that we have all the tools at hand to do.
Very well stated. I'm reminded of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer saying a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Everything is kind of shaken loose and moving. And I think, as you note, Joaquim, there's an opportunity for this community, not just the people on the panel, but the people listening in, to help make the case that investments in low-carbon, high-efficiency solutions are, in fact, job-generating. I want to throw it open to the panel for reflections on this tension in the narrative between don't scare people by talking about climate, and also maybe speak out if people are using the crisis to go back to bad old ways. Is that resonating with any of our panelists? I'm looking especially at Jolie, Scott, and Leo, who haven't responded in this round. Leo, I will come to you for closing remarks, but I think we have enough time if you have observations on that as well.
Well, I think the main issue now is how do we find solutions that will immediately address the needs of employment, of wage recovery, of small business recovery, while at the same time having some co-benefits in climate. I think Amal-Lee and Joaquim have talked about essentially a major public works program that could help in many countries, where you can put people to work right away in revenue generating and wage generating employment that would also address the nature-based solutions that we've been talking about for years now. So you need to find those places that address both. We can't just do things right now that are only climate, that don't have important spillovers on wages and recovery. And at the same time, it would be best not to do things that have no climate benefits at all. So finding that sweet spot between the two is going to be crucial. And I think the other point I'd make here is a lot of money is going to go through so-called financial intermediaries, as Jolie explained. A lot of money will flow through other banks, not just the MDVs. The MDVs will lend to local banks. Those banks will then lend it on. How do we make sure those intermediaries are making the same types of prioritization, that they're also thinking smartly about how to get that money to go farther in terms of social impact? And that'll be, I think, quite important. We can't have those banks just think traditionally in business as usual ways at a time like this.
Thank you, Leo. See, both Jolie and Scott had their hands up. Maybe Jolie, I'll go to you, and then to Scott. Scott, somebody said they couldn't hear you. I can hear you. It's a bit echoey, but I don't know if we can redress that now or not. Jolie, did you want to speak?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. I just wanted to echo a point Leo was making just now about financial intermediaries and the types of instruments that are going to be used in response to this crisis. I think, the institutions themselves have mechanisms already in place that can really shed light on where some of this financing is going. And they do have strong standards that can be applied to these investments to make sure that they're not ending up in financing projects like in fossil fuels and other things indirectly that can serve to undermine the response. But those mechanisms need to be applied with fidelity, and they need to be taken very seriously in times like this. And public accountability is so important. The more transparency around these types of investments, the better that the public is able to track where these are going. We can really see the development impact. We can course correct where things are going wrong, if investments are ending up in the wrong places. So making sure that we have as much transparency and accountability around these investments is incredibly important. Also, the ability for people in these countries to really participate in these decisions, that are impacting their lives and are going to set them on a course for hopefully a low carbon resilient future. People need to have the opportunities to engage in the development conversation, and more transparency around these processes and around the investments that are being made can allow people to engage in that conversation and help to influence where the development agenda is going in their countries. So strong safeguards, public accountability, making sure that those mechanisms are well resourced in the institutions is really important at a time like this.
Transparency and participation, never misplaced when looking for solutions to complex problems. Scott, any observations you have on this whole tangle of questions that have been coming up?
Right, and I hope you can hear me okay. I guess one point I think it's important to make is that I either think or maybe I hope that a collateral benefit of this crisis is it does demonstrate what is possible when it comes to mobilizing capital cheaply for these broad public goals, with climate being at the top of the list. So let me just give you an example of that. If you look at the global financial crisis, over a decade ago now, before that crisis, the multilateral development banks really didn't have, frankly, a lot of demand among their large economy client countries, the emerging markets. Demand had fallen off. The crisis hits, demand spikes dramatically. There's a lot of crisis lending. And then, maybe the surprise of what followed is that demand never went away, that it actually, the crisis itself sort of drove a new embrace of these institutions among their clients, and countries that hadn't been borrowing, spent much of the decade that followed, really maintaining a level of interest. Another important thing I think happened during that same period is that these institutions themselves moved forward with much more rigorous commitments around climate. So I think all of that suggests to me, and when we get to a post-crisis period this time around, there's much more potential for the MDBs in particular maintaining a level of financing and support that is much higher, and doing that in support of these climate goals and commitments they've already made, and having willing partners among their client countries. So none of that is inevitable, but I think there's a lot of potential for it, and particularly, again, on the financing side, recognizing some of the magic of what these institutions can do in, their low cost of borrowing, mobilizing that money, scaling it up on behalf of their clients.
Thank you, Scott. This resonates with one of the participants, somebody probably known to Jolie since he's at the Bank Information Center. Lad Connell said, since the bank is able to allocate $160 billion for COVID in the coming year, why can it only come up with a planned $200 billion over 5 years, including private funds for the climate crisis? And I think that sort of goes to your point that the demonstration that in response to a crisis, the multilaterals can use their AAA ratings. Of course, there needs to be demand, but the demonstration of the multilateral system to come up with resources. We're coming close to the end. I think one of our learnings from these is that after about an hour, people get fatigued. I'm going to ask the panel members, if any of you, I'm not going to call on everybody, but if anybody has a burning point they want to make in 30 seconds, and then I'm going to ask Leo for closing remarks.
I just wanted to say, I think, particularly to Anthony Hobley's point, I think, we need to recognize this is about delivering now on the SDGs. Climate is the biggest threat to that. And the response to COVID is about creating a more inclusive society that everyone, including future generations, can benefit from, because I think the path we were on was not sustainable in any shape or form. But I agree, we need to get that narrative right, and really we already have the SDGs in place, so perhaps that's where we focus.
Thank you, Amal-Lee. That's so succinct. I'm going to contradict myself and ask each of our panel members to give us a very brief closing thought, 30 seconds or less. Jolie?
Sure, thanks. And maybe just to also respond to one of the questions in the chat, what can the MDBs do to ensure adequate social and environmental risk management while being able to fast track? I think there's a lot of opportunity here to be creative, find new ways to do things, engaging with people, taking that really seriously, and really prioritizing the most vulnerable. The MDBs have a lot of great rhetoric around this, but not a lot of really solid guidance for how staff should be doing this and how to really live out this mandate. And I think now's the time to really put some of those policies in place, share that type of guidance, try new things, and I think people can really take this opportunity to do that in a much better way.
Thank you. Joaquim, closing thoughts from you.
I think that we have short-term needs, and which is get the economies back, and we have to do this also thinking at the medium long-term objective. And the majority of development banks do have a very good technical team, and this helps to design the kind of conditions that could make climate an integral part of these, say, policies to restart the economy. So we have to take advantage of these, both in the multilateral banks, but also in the national banks. And then you can work through the other financial intermediaries and get finally to companies at all levels. They're very important levers. And the more you accelerate also the integration of climate concerns in risk management in general, financial risk management in general, the faster will be this transformation of the global economy, and we may get some good things out of this terrible tragedy, which is a pandemic.
Thank you, Joaquim. Scott, any final thoughts?
I guess, and unfortunately on a pessimistic note, I do think one aspect of this one aspect that feels unprecedented in this crisis is the potential that it could be with us for quite a while, longer than we're used to in dealing with major crises internationally. And in that sense, it sort of raises the issue of trade-offs more starkly. And colleagues at CGD in the health sector are looking at the challenges of combating the coronavirus in terms of what it does for other health initiatives. Mortality from other diseases that aren't being treated as resources are reallocated. And I think that that points to a larger challenge for the development, the development agenda and for developing countries is how do we manage that? I think to some degree the answer comes back to mobilizing money. That basically there needs to be a sustained public response to this that involves international institutions, donor countries, developing countries themselves, and we have to be prepared to act in a way that perhaps we don't have a precedent for.
Thank you, Scott. Leo, final closing remarks from you, and then I will send us off.
Thanks so much, and thank you, everybody. It's been really a fantastic panel, and it's very timely. I just want to close with three, hopefully, provocative ideas. The first is that we have to win the economic stabilization battle. If we don't do that, we will emerge from this crisis with very badly depleted financial capital as well as political capital to fight the climate war, which will follow. So we have to hit this with everything we've got so that we can get back to a semblance of economic stability. The second is we have to learn more quickly than we ever have. In other words, we've been talking here for the last hour about better ways to do development quickly, how to integrate climate into development bank programming, how to do policy-based lending more effectively. We've been working on these things for years now, and now it's time to put it all to work in a very quick space of time. This is not a time for 50-page papers. This is time for 2-page memos that are concrete, that are innovative, that can be put to work next week and next month. So this is the time when our job collectively is to make sure that these solutions are devised quickly and put in place in a practical way, and to sell them politically, which is going to be crucial. And finally, and this is, I think, a sobering reality, but the industrialized countries, the largest economies, starting with China, the US, and Europe, we're going to probably recover, almost certainly we're going to recover more quickly. There's simply more money, more institutional capacity to do it. The rest of the world will take longer to recover. And that means that in terms of climate ambition, the world will be looking a lot more to those big economies to help us lead the emissions reduction over the coming years, because the level of economic recovery will be different. And so I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we begin to hopefully control this crisis.
Thank you very much, Leo. That was very thoughtful. I want to come back and unpack that. I suspect some of our listeners may want to. So I want to say that this recording will be posted on the event page. If you know others who weren't able to be here, the time zone doesn't work for everybody, please do share it. Leo, I was so struck by what you said. This is not a time for 50-page papers, but for 2-page memos. A number of people listening in today. We had more than 300 at the peak, still more than 200 and close to 300 people. Some of you are actually in position to write those 2-page memos. And I hope that the discussion today and the resources that we offer at WRI will be useful to you. We also want to look for ways to hear more from you. We've begun experimenting with sending out follow-up emails with the survey. We haven't yet designed the survey. We're making this up as we go along, but we will be sending out a note with the link to the recording and maybe a survey. We'll also be capturing your questions here. Like the rest of you, we are feeling our way through this crisis at the World Resources Institute. Our commitment to sustainable, inclusive, climate-safe development is unchanged. The world in which we pursue that is profoundly different. And so we appreciate people joining us today to help us think our way through that. Thank you all very much. If you arrived here today, you are probably on a list where you'll get invited to subsequent events. We do hope that you'll join us again. Finally, thank you to Scott, Joaquim, Amal-Lee, Jolie, and Anthony, who had to drop off, and to my colleagues at WRI. You see their names at the bottom of the screen, who are the magic behind the screen making all of this hold together. Thank you all very much. We hope to see you next time.